Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
And I'm Michaela, human being here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
And here for another book talking. This time, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine.
The Time Machine.
Yes, one of his classics, the very first book that he wrote, the one that put him on the map in a literary sense. And like a lot of his work, it's still a very good read today.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's
absolutely.
very suspenseful.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you don't know it's just so creative. It's absolutely bananas, the level of imagination that goes into this one.
Wells was such a genius. We said last time that he basically invented science fiction. In this book, he's the first person to come up with the idea of a scientific way of traveling through time. When time travel had been used in fiction before, it had always been magical. The best example being Christmas Carol by Dickens. So the idea was out there, but to actually have a scientist invent something that lets you travel through time, he coined the phrase time machine.
Yes.
I mean, what else would you call it? And thinking about the ramifications of what time travel means and so forth. And like everything he writes, he does it in such a logical and sensible manner, it's almost impossible to believe that it isn't somehow true on some level.
Yeah, no, it's especially when they're explaining it. I mean, the full beginning, the opening of this book is just them explaining how it works.
Yeah, the whole opening is that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and we'll go through a little bit of the plot.
Yeah.
Just as someone out there might not have read it. But basically, a guy in Victorian England invents a time machine. He is yet another unnamed narrator, the second we've seen from Wells.
This time he is the time traveler.
He is the time traveler, yeah.
Like, there's 2, 3 characters in here that have actual names?
A couple of characters have names. This is one of those story within a story kind of things. You have the outer narrator, which is a guy named Hilliard.
Yes.
And Hilliard is telling the reader about his friend, the time traveler. And he's actually recounting events that happened 3 years earlier, though we don't find that out until like later in the book. And the inner narrative is the story of the time traveler who tells his friends who've gathered at his house what happened to him on his journey into the future.
Yeah, they sit down to a very nice dinner. They invite, there's the journalist, the editor, the medical man, the psychologist, all these archetypical...
Other people with mostly no names.
Yeah.
And he recounts his adventures in the future, and again, it's very well done. So we get that first-person narration of the time traveler. In the future, he discovers that mankind, through a process of evolution, and he speculates a great deal as to how this might have occurred, have split into 2 species.
Yep.
You have the Eloi, who are the short and pale and very weak and shall we say mentally challenged?
Just the intellect is just not
there.
They
intellect is not there.
They live a very easy life where, all they really do is just run around and play. He compares them to children.
Yeah, they're like children. Yeah.
Children are pets. Is what he says, because they're very just happy-go-lucky. Yeah. They live in a world of plenty. They just eat nothing but fruit, and they just hang out, and they're just these tiny little people. It kind of feels like little fake creatures just enjoying nature and just hanging out.
And there's another race, though, called the Morlocks, who live underground.
Yes.
And the symbiotic relationship between the 2 species is something a time traveler spends a great deal of time speculating on. He guesses wrong a couple of times in the book. He makes some bad mistakes before he finally realizes, to his horror, what the actual relationship between them is.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes in the book, although it happens pretty early on but can be applied to multiple of his theories, are, "Very simple was my explanation, and plausible enough, as most wrong theories are." That feels that's the majority as you figure things out through the eyes of the
guy
of the
is
narrator.
A scientist, and so he comes up with theories and tests them and then tosses them aside and he discovers that they're not true.
Yeah.
Which is one of the great things about the book. You walk through the future with him and find things out. It's also funny because Wells was a socialist, and many books are written around this time period where they project into the future. Someone falls to suspended animation, wakes up 100 years in the future and finds some utopian society, and then the author would use that as a way of explaining how he thinks society should change to be better. Yep. And while Wells had very strong views about what society needed to survive, that is not what this book is about.
No, if anything, he's ripping on communism, hardcore in this book. Absolutely. And just how human beings as we are, and this is a theme that is discussed throughout the entire in the entire book. I have tons of quotes basically restating the same exact thing, is that when human beings are not challenged, our intellect just goes.
Our intellect withers, if there's no challenge. The Eloi lead too soft a life, literally. They have no challenges, nothing to drive them or motivate them, so they don't do anything.
Their language, as he says, does not contain many words.
Yeah.
Their language doesn't contain many words. It's just absolutely nutty.
But he first takes it for kind of a utopian society. They have no needs, no wants, and he finds himself attracted to them because they're so pretty.
Yeah.
And he identifies with them, but at the same time, he has nothing in common with them. And he soon realizes it's the opposite of utopian society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It felt very Gulliver's Travels, just because he was
Gulliver's
around
Travels
all these
is definitely one of the books that
inspired absolutely.
Him,
reading this, it was just very much very much a Gulliver's Travels experience. But absolutely. It's absolutely nutty. But yeah, the Eloi, they're just very happy-go-lucky. I think most of the time they're just picking flowers.
They pick flowers, and the idea in several different unauthorized sequels and so forth of him settling down with the Eloys, it would be impossible.
Absolutely. Just from a biology standpoint, he is big and they are small. And
they are childlike.
Yeah.
Well, they never get a very hot actress to play, when they do the film versions, but we'll get to that later. So the book. The book is amazing. It's really well written. When I read it as a kid, although I understood what Wells was talking about, I didn't grasp a lot of the more subtle nuances. In fact, some of them I didn't grasp until I read an annotated version. I have no version of Time Machine with a decent cover to it, but the best one that I've read is this one, which has the worst cover in the world.
Oh, yes.
There's a whole series of these, and they all have the same identical, horrible cover. It is The Time Machine and Invention, a critical text of the 1895 first edition, edited by Leon Stover. The critical text versions of Wells are just brilliant.
Yeah.
The guy's footnotes are amazing. He analyzes it from several different points of view. And one thing he points out that I would not have gotten, because I'm not that familiar with socialism in the late 19th century. First of all, the Eloi.
Yeah.
What do the Eloi symbolize or represent? Now, no one actually knows, because Wells didn't say out loud, but one thing that occurred to people at the time the book came out was that they represent the aesthetic movement.
Yeah.
The one started by Oscar Wilde, which was involved in decadence, in which you pursue pleasure and happiness and so forth at the expense of all else. And the Eloi are the ultimate result of that living just for pleasure.
Yeah, they're full-on hedonists.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they wear clothes, but there's also in a very erotic state. You get the feeling they just couple with each other, like animals, basically.
Yeah, they do talk about that as well in the book. It's just
he's very circumspect, being a Victorian, but that's exactly what the Eloi are like. And the other thing I learned from this was the unnamed people who gather around.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, Wells himself had gatherings of like-minded people at his house all the time. So I imagine he was writing up this as a bunch of his friends hanging out with him. But the people in the book, the ones that we can identify for sure, are all notable socialists.
Yeah.
The guy with the bright red hair who's argumentative is clearly George Bernard Shaw.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. And they mentioned some guy is the inventor of a famous chair, and that is William Morris, who invented the Morris chair. That's the reclining chair they use in barbershops and things like that.
Okay.
He's also a noted socialist. Although he and Wells disagreed on their style of socialism, are not adept enough in the different strands of socialism to understand the difference between them. But although they were both socialists, he disagreed with Morris's view of the future. And Morris would himself later write a book about the future, giving his utopian version of it. But as I said, utopia was not what Wells was talking about. I think in some ways Wells was an anti-utopianist, that he didn't really believe mankind could get any better. So,
for a form of utopia, you need everybody to agree, and that's just unrealistic.
It's unrealistic. So basically, he travels to the future. He meets these people and interacts with them as best he can. He loses his time machine in a scene that is still very traumatic, even though I know how the book ends.
Oh yeah, no,
I was still very dramatic.
I was reading that and I was like, oh, he's having a panic attack. He is having a full-blown panic attack, as would anybody in that situation. It winds up being hidden in the base of a sphinx.
Yes, the sphinx is kind of odd because it's never really explained.
Well, a lot of the structures, I was just kind of like, where is this? Granted, it is the year 802,751, something, something in that ballpark. Yeah. But yeah, there's the Sphinx. There is a museum that now is just, they call it the Green Palace because it's all, overgrown. And
the books are all rotted and decaying, and virtually everything in there that could be useful to him has already fallen apart.
They live in the remnants of what was clearly once a very beautiful society. And it's all just, everything is decaying and crumbling. Like
The critical edition does have a map detailing the sites that he sees that can actually be identified. Yeah. It shows a map of his wanderings in the future.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yes, someone did sit down and try to figure it out from the few clues that he gives us. Because much like War of the Worlds, the settings are actually real. Yeah. Even though he allows for a great deal of time to pass between the present day and that. I found it very suspenseful.
Oh, absolutely. I really liked the struggle between the Morlocks. I thought the Morlocks were so cool. He describes them as these great white creatures akin to apes, almost like they're these big white apes walking around. They have a very different physicality to the Eloi, but they're both evolved from
They're both evolved from the human race. Yeah.
I even have a quote. So in the end, above ground, you must have the haves, pursuing pleasure and comfort and beauty, and below ground the have-nots, the workers getting continually adapted to the conditions of their labor. Once they were there, they would no doubt have to pay rent, and not for a little of it, for the ventilation of their caverns, and if they refused, they would starve or be suffocated for arrears. Such to them as were so constituted by miserable and rebellious would die, and in the end, the balance being permanent, the survivors would become as well adapted to the conditions of underground life and as happy in their ways as the upper world people were to theirs, because you adapt to your situation.
Yeah, it's about class distinction. The differences between the haves and have-nots. That's the theme of this one. That the have-nots now reduced to a state where they literally live underground.
Yeah, they fear light. They fear like any sort of. That definitely comes into play.
And being a Victorian gentleman, he naturally believes that the Eloi were the ones in charge and the Morlocks were their servants. But he soon comes to realize almost the exact opposite is true.
Well, yeah, even then, the Eloi, the elevated of the two groups, there is this character, Weena. She is one of the Eloi, and she kind of gets, they're all playing in the water, and she gets swept off, and she's going to drown, and none of her people...
Everyone ignores her, because, she's drowning, oh well.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, she's dead, and he saves her. And he says they're of such little intellect, he did not expect an apology, a thank you. Yeah. And she follows him around like a puppy for the rest.
For the rest of the book.
She makes him like this big flower garland, and she cannot be separated from him. He is her protector now.
Yeah, exactly. She's adopted him, sort of.
Yeah.
But it is like a pet, like you said earlier.
It is like a pet. That he describes her as such a couple times, like a child or a pet. She cannot be separated from me. She just wants to be around me.
Yeah. Wells used a lot of influence. Like I said, Gulliver's Travels was a big part of it. Also things from his life. Supposedly as a child, he had a fear of working class people, which was really weird because he came from lower classes himself, really.
How Victorian.
Exactly. He remembers being terrified as a child of watching the people delivering coal, carrying these huge sacks of coal with their faces blackened from the coal dust and things like that.
I mean, as a child, probably
they were scary looking. Yeah. He also had a fear of gorillas because he saw one in a book, an encyclopedia, and it frightened him. So in a lot of ways, the Morlocks are sort of like working class gorillas, so to speak.
Yeah, no, he describes them as like they're great
how
apes.
He describes them. Yeah. That's where that comes from, I think.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. But the warnings that he gives about the separation between the classes is like more true now than it was even when he wrote it. And he was seeing the split between the people happening even in the Victorian age. One of the things that amused me about the book, and I read it again as an adult, was the fact that many Victorians love the theory of evolution because they didn't understand it.
Yeah.
They assumed evolution was kind of survival of the fittest and so forth. And England was the greatest country in the world. They controlled like half the world at this point. And so obviously evolution had favored them, the British. And so that meant they were evolutionarily superior to the lesser ones who hasn't, conquered the world and so forth. But, Wells knew obviously evolution doesn't play favorites.
Yeah.
Everybody gets chewed up as the millennia pass. And so in a way he was kind of shaking the British people, much like he did in War of the Worlds, trying to get them to wake up to what was going on in the world around them. That it wasn't going to turn out well for you in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful book. I would love to touch a little bit on the climate change aspects of it.
Yeah.
They do talk about how the sun is getting dimmer, yet the world is getting hotter.
Yeah.
And I thought that was cool that he mentioned that within the book.
He based that on scientific theories at the time,
Scientific theories at the time, and it that at least is a little bit true, but even still, like, there's tons of theory as to why the world is getting hotter within the novel. I thought that was cool, not just the change in people, but the change in the environment as well. There are a couple pieces of the book where this is definitely written in 1895 as far as referencing like people from the continent of Africa and things like that. Some of the language he uses, it's not in a negative way, but it's definitely it's definitely some language that he uses. I would love to, do you think it's okay to talk about the other places he visits in the future?
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I just want to talk about the giant crabs.
Yeah, the giant crabs are terrifying.
They were absolutely terrifying. Just he goes even further in the future.
Yeah.
And just gets out and immediately gets attacked by these giant crabs.
Yeah, I remember thinking the first time I read, he's going to get killed millions of years in the future, and just lie there dead next to his time machine because that giant freaking crab attacks him.
No, but they're having a nice Victorian dinner, so he's fine. He's fine.
Yeah.
There's the crabs, and then there was just the only living thing that he could spot when he goes even further into the future is a black blob with tentacles and...
Yeah, nothing even remotely human is left on the world.
Yeah.
But the sun is already going up at that point, so humans probably couldn't survive there for very long.
No.
Yeah. There is a deleted chapter that's in the critical edition in which he stops prior to the crabs. And he sees these like white albino creatures that hop around like kangaroos.
Oh.
And they have tiny, like almost humanoid hands. And when he looks in their faces, he becomes terrified that this is what the Eloi become. That they literally become animals over the course of evolution.
Well, possibly when you lose that human creativity, that human intelligence, that's essentially what happens. They're already at the point where he's comparing them to pets and or like an underdeveloped human brain or like a child, and it's just the human brain will atrophy till all that's left is that animal instinct.
That's all. It was a real warning to people, most of whom didn't get it probably.
No, they definitely didn't get it. And another message in this book is, human civilization is temporary. Yeah. Once we are gone, we're gone. The world will continue on without us.
Yeah, the world keeps going after people aren't there anymore. The same way the world will keep going after the British Empire stopped being an empire. But for Victorians, it was so hard to conceive of the world as being that way.
Yeah. It is a law of nature we overlook, that intellectual versatility is the compensation for change, danger, and trouble. An animal perfect in its harmony with its environment and is a perfect mechanism. Nature never appeals to intelligence until habit and instinct are useless. There is no intelligence when there is no change and no need of change. Only those animals partake of intelligence that have a huge variety of needs and dangers. Mm-hmm. We need adversity.
Exactly, yeah. And having a brain isn't necessarily to your evolutionary advantage. The dinosaurs ruled the earth for millions of years, and they had tiny brains the size of walnuts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, evolution doesn't play favorites.
No. What was once a T-Rex is now a chicken.
Is now a chicken. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Very good point. Wells doesn't make that point, but that is exactly true. I want to talk about some of the filmed versions and spin-offs and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been filmed several times, the two very famous ones. And the movies, just like War of the Worlds, the movies really don't capture the gist of what Wells was trying to say. The 1960 one, produced by George Powell, starred Rod Taylor and Yvette Mimieux as Weena. And that's the most famous one. I saw it when I was a kid. I really loved it. And part of it does have the feel of Wells's book.
Well, it's just the novelty and how cool it is to have a time machine in a really cool new setting. I think they
really
kind of
capture that. It won the Academy Award for special effects, the sequence where he travels through time. And it justifiably, particularly in 1960s technology. He did some amazing stuff with that. But they make the Eloy a little too intelligent, so Yvette Mimieux can basically be kind of a love interest for our hero. And you're given the strong impression our hero manages to defeat the Morlocks and free the Eloy, even though it doesn't really work like that.
Yeah, no, they made it kind of more of a, hero saves damsel story
as opposed
to I am from another time and I am here observing as a man of science.
Yeah, exactly. Even more egregious when it comes to changing things is the 2002 version with Guy Pearce, with Jeremy Irons as the Morlock King.
Oh, God.
Oh, yeah. It was bad. Samantha Mumba played, she's not even called Weena anymore. That's how much of the book he tossed out. Now, the humorous part about all this, and this really made me laugh when I saw the interview. I decided not to see this in theaters because I saw an interview with the director. The director was Simon Wells, the great-grandson of H.G. Wells. But talent is not genetic.
No.
And he said that he had didn't use many of the themes of his forebearers' work because the real theme of it is about class distinction, and there's not such an issue anymore as it was in the Victorian age. He says, while the 1% continue to buy up the rest of the earth they don't already own, seemingly oblivious to how society actually works.
Yeah.
So in this one, instead of being helpless and childlike and pale, the Eloy are this tribe of kick-ass barbarians who are really self-sufficient and capable of taking care of themselves and have this really cool city. And they got all these tribal tattoos and everything. And they still speak English, but to them it's like Latin, a dead language that no one uses anymore.
Okay, so it's Mad Max. Cool.
It's kind of Mad Maxy. Yeah. And Jeremy Irons plays a Morlock with a extra large brain that gives him telepathy for no good reason. It literally hits none of the important points of the book. Not a single one. It manages to carefully avoid every important thing that H.G. Wells had to say in his story.
It feels very like Mad Max meets X-Men.
Yeah.
That's weird.
It's just not good at all. And Guy Pearce is a great actor. And they throw in a lot of bits about him using the machine to go back in time and save his fiancée who was killed in a car accident, discovering you can't change the past and so forth. Which was nice, but it's nothing you can't see on an average episode of Doctor Who.
It's sounding like a really weird episode of Doctor Who.
It's just not that good. There were many, many books that were sequels. Sequels, spin-offs, and so forth. Since at the end of this story, the time traveler promises to go back to the future and come back with absolute proof positive of what he's seen. And he disappears, and the narrator, goes back to find him, and the time machine has vanished, and he hasn't returned.
Yeah.
And he never returns. So no one knows what happened to him. That leaves it very much open to spin-offs and sequels. The libraries, I discovered the Rhode Island system doesn't have a lot of these, possibly because a lot of them aren't that good.
Well, I could see with time travel, it's either phenomenal or it's
Yeah. I already mentioned the critical edition of H.G. Wells with the horrible garish orange covers. These are in the library, fortunately, which is good because they're hardcovers and they're meant to be college textbooks, so they're really expensive.
Yeah.
Yes. Here's a clue to publishers. Cheap paperback editions would actually sell more, but that's an argument for another day. There have been so many things. There's one called Space Machine by Christopher Priest, in which Priest points out that to travel through time, you have to travel through space as well.
Yeah, that is the fourth dimension.
It's the fourth dimension. I mean, the Earth is constantly moving, so to stay in the same spot on a moving Earth over the centuries, you have to travel through space. And so he has someone stumbling across a time machine the time machine, and using it to go not to Earth, but to Mars right before the Martian invasion. Guess what? It's also a spin-off of War of the Worlds, simultaneously. Yeah. It's a novel idea.
Yeah, no, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea, but just kind of, George Powell wrote Time Machine 2, which is one of his several attempts to do a sequel to Time Machine. In this one, the time traveler and Weena have a child, and he takes them back to Victorian England, but they wind up accidentally stopping during the Blitz and they're killed in a Nazi bomb. So their child is raised in America, of course, and then goes back to England and discovers his heritage and his father's old notes and rebuilds the time machine and goes to the future to try to locate his parents. The whole idea of the time traveler and Weena getting together as a couple is really...
It's icky.
It's icky. Just not good. Whenever she gets scared or upset, he lights a match and she laughs delightedly till the match burns out. That's not a healthy relationship.
Yeah, no.
It's terrible, and yet several people, not just George Powell, they just can't get over the idea that the book is a romance. It's not. It's called a scientific romance, but that's because the word romance had a totally different meaning back in the Victorian age. There's one called Morlock Nights by K.W. Jeter. He's one of the founders of the steampunk movement. And I really wanted to like this book, but I didn't. And this one, the Morlocks get their hands on his machine enough that they figure out how it works, and they go back in time to invade England. The problem is, though, they wind up being opposed by King Arthur, who is resurrected to defend England in its hour of need. Because someone apparently wanted King Arthur and Merlin fighting Morlocks in London.
Why not?
It's too many ideas. It's just doesn't make it. There's one called, I thought this was hysterical. I wasn't able to find a copy of it. Time Machine Troopers.
Oh, God.
It's as bad as it sounds, apparently. I haven't read it. The time traveler joins up with Robert Baden-Powell, the real-world founder of the Boy Scouts. And he goes to the future to teach self-reliance and woodcrafting skills to the Eloi so they can defend themselves against the Morlocks. Yeah.
I don't have no comment.
Yeah. And this one, which I did find a copy of in the library, The Time Ships, which I have read. Although the plot is so complicated, I had to look it up to remind myself exactly what happened in the bloody book.
Yeah.
Okay. So the time traveler goes forward to try to locate Weena. But he winds up going further into the future and runs into Morlocks, who are now super intelligent. He discovers he's a lot more in common with the Morlocks than he does with the Eloi, which is true because the Morlocks are scientists like him. And the Morlock also explained that as he told his friends about what happened, one of them published his account, and because of that, mankind was warned, and so the original split didn't occur, and there actually is no Weena because the Eloi never evolved in this universe. It's just Morlocks now. So he tries to go back and stop his younger self from going on the time travel trip and relating the story. But instead he winds up in 1938, where World War I is still going on, and it's being fought with time machines where British agents are going back to change Germany's history. And then it gets complicated.
Oh, God.
Because then you have characters of all these different parallel timelines, all, Yeah. It's a very thought-provoking idea. It was an authorized sequel. I mentioned Baxter last week. He loves H.G. Wells, but writes nothing like him.
Yeah.
There's nothing that H.G. Wells would even contemplate writing in a million years. And as always, it hits none of the tropes that made the original book interesting to read. So, it won the Philip K. Dick Award and the John W. Campbell Memorial Award. So it's not a badly written book at all. It's just so out there.
I was going to say complicated, very complicated.
It is really complicated, yeah.
Sometimes I like a book where I need a notebook to keep track of what I'm reading, but...
In this case, what universe the different characters are from. Yeah. Because the 1938 universe isn't the same universe that becomes the Morlock world that our hero comes from, who still comes from main timeline Victorian London,
This feels like the Marvel multiverse theory, and
the sacred timeline is collapsing, as they would say on Loki.
Yes.
But there's much less complicated and really cool stories out there. Yes, obviously Alan Moore had to deal with the time travel in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It's in a text feature in the back. And of course, being a League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, he has Alan Quatermain, who's experimenting with a drug that allows him to basically project his psychic consciousness, which actually was something Alan Quatermain did in the Haggard books. Yeah. And he winds up in this sort of like timeless void where he encounters John Carter of Mars, Edgar Rice Burroughs' hero, who can also project himself from Earth to Mars, but gets trapped in the same void. And Howard Carter, who is like a distant relative of John Carter. He's a recurring character created by H.P. Lovecraft in a whole set of Cthulhu stories. So they wind up trapped in this void, and they're attacked by creatures, these white-furred creatures that Carter identifies as Migo. But then who should arrive but the time traveler in his time machine, who sensed the temporal disturbance and come there to rescue them. He calls them Morlocks, but they make the Lovecraftian connection. They're actually Migo. Instead. Okay. So naturally they have to fight their way free from these creatures and escape and get back to what passes for normal reality. Yeah, it's a text feature with great illustrations. Awesome. It's actually really, really good. It's short, it's sweet. It originally ran as like 2 or 3 page segments in the back of each issue that are all collected in the graphic novel.
The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
But it's not my favorite, though. It's close, but it's not my favorite. Something actually exceeds League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in my mind. Yes, it does. One of my favorite stories of all time is Time After Time.
Oh.
This is the book by Carl Alexander. The book isn't famous. It was made into a really great movie, one of my favorite movies ever. The book was actually unfinished when he approached Nicholas Meyer of 7% Solution fame and Wrath of Khan fame, and showed him the unfinished manuscript and said, "What do you think of this?" And Myers liked it so much he bought the film rights for it when it was still unpublished.
That's awesome.
The story is that good.
That's awesome.
Yes, and Myers went on to like direct the movie, and the book came out. So the movie starred Malcolm McDowell as H.G. Wells, because in this one H.G. Wells is the time traveler, which is also true in several other versions. And during the famous like meeting at his house, with the gathering of his friends, David Warner is there playing a doctor. And you hear the sound of like police whistles outside. The police are searching for someone. And so the guy, Warner's character named Stevenson, rushes to the time machine and jumps into it and takes off.
Okay.
He doesn't know how to set it though, because so it automatically slingshots back after he jumps out of it, back to where it started. So H.G. Wells goes through the valise that he left behind, discovered it's full of bloody clothes and a razor-sharp knife, and he identifies Stevenson as Jack the Ripper. So now Jack the Ripper has stolen the time machine and gone forward to the inconceivable future of 1979.
That's why they never caught him.
Yes, that's why the Ripper was never caught. So Wells realizes this is all his responsibility, so he climbs into the time machine and goes forward to track him down.
1979?
Yes, he runs into a 1970s woman, played by Mary Steenburgen, who is awesome. And she has the same name as the person we know will become his second wife. Anyway, so Wells hopes that it'll be a socialist utopia by the 1970s. I mean, how could it not be? But of course, he's very much disappointed by the 70s. It does not live up to his expectations. On the other hand, Stevenson is thrilled because of all like the sex and violence and so forth. And, he thinks, this is like a whole world of my fondest dreams come true.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Strippers and, violent street gangs and,
I could see him having a lot of fun in the late 70s.
Yeah, so it pits, a time-crazed Jack the Ripper against the studious, H.G. Wells.
I love it.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It is absolutely brilliant. It's one of those movies I've seen like a half a dozen times.
I've never even heard of this.
Time after time, Malcolm McDowell. Malcolm McDowell had just made Caligula, and he wanted a character who was so good and pure, made people forget the horrible movie Caligula. And so he settled on H.G. Wells, and he does a really good job with this kind of stuffy, uptight, but still incredibly righteous and forthright character. Awesome. And Mary Steenburgen, humorously enough, was so good at playing a time-lost love interest, she would play virtually the exact same part again in Back to the Future 3. Yep. Yeah, virtually the same character. That was kind of an in-joke on Bob Zemeckis' part.
I love it.
Yes, Time After Time, Malcolm McDowell. The book is good. The movie is even better. It was made into a short-lived TV series that was so bad it only lasted 5 episodes. And I've yet to find a single episode to watch. But the movie is great.
Awesome. Sold. Movie night at your house. Let's go.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts. I do have a quote about, just how time travel works in general. For instance, here is a portrait of a man at 8 years old, another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on. All these are evidently sections, as it were.
Yeah.
3-dimensional representations of his 4-dimensional being, which is fixed and an unalterable thing.
Yeah, his 4th-dimensional being. They're like slices of bologna, each one.
It's the cross-section of a human being.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah, he had his way of describing things that made it seem so real to people.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, and Time Machine.
Time Machine, book. Yeah, H.G. Wells was a genius.
Yeah, he was.
Yep. All right, so we'll be back next time with even more H.G. Wells goodness.
Yeah, even more H.G. Wells is a genius.
Yeah, more of H.G. Wells is a genius. Until next time, I have been Ed.
I have been Michaela.
Take care and be safe.
Be happy, be healthy.
Bye.
Bye.